My name's Pete, and I'm a part of Christian Union here. We run events like this to answer some questions people often have about Christianity. And today's question is on why bother with God when science explains me. We'll be hearing from a research fellow here at the university called Jon Dawson over here, and he'll be addressing this question. This will be followed by a time of questions and answers. So if you do have a question, wait until the end. You can text in a question, and we'll try and answer it. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Jon. Should we give him a round of applause?
Great. Hello, everyone. So it's great to be with you today. As I said, my name is Jon Dawson. I'm a senior research fellow here in the Faculty of Medicine, working in the very interesting area of regenerative medicine, to trying to use stem cells to regenerate bits of tissue in our body when they fall off or stop working. My particular interest is in using clay nanoparticles as a way of delivering stem cells and drugs into the body to activate stem cells, which sounds, I know, like a really unlikely idea. I've actually been given £1 million by the government to make it work, so I'm just really hoping it works because it's taxpayers' money and all that. But I'm here today on my lunch break in a personal capacity, slightly extended lunch break, to help address this question that we put out. Why should I believe in God when science has explained me? This is part of a whole week of events we've called Human as part of the Christian Union. And we're doing this really to give you the opportunity and encourage you to look into the Christian message yourself. Christians call their message gospel, which literally means good news. And it's good because it shows us that behind everything, ultimate reality is a God who at his core is love. The reason you and I exist is, the reason we're here is not as a result of a cosmic accident. We're not here on the whim of some all-powerful deity who made us with a flex of his muscles just because he can, but we're here out of the overflowing creative generosity of a God who is love. And if that's true, it changes everything. It means life's not just about surviving long enough to pass on your genes. It's not about passing some big moral exam to somehow justify your existence. Life is about knowing this God who made us, living out your potential in this world he's made. It's a very life-affirming, dignifying message, a very humanizing message. We call it good news. And yet, we're very aware that there's all kinds of really fundamental and significant questions and concerns and suspicions that people have about the Christian message. And so really we want to use these lunchtimes as a way to address some of these issues head on, in the hope that we can open up investigations into the possibility that this could be true. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. And the question we're looking at today is, why bother with God when science explains me? It's a very powerful idea, this idea that science has totally eliminated any need to talk about or believe in God. This is Peter Atkins, who was visiting the university a couple of weeks ago, professor of chemistry at Oxford. And he says this about the relationship between science and religion. Science, the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared, reproducible knowledge, emerged from religion. As science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath. So for Peter Atkins, religion had a role to play in our intellectual history and intellectual development as human beings, but that role has now been thoroughly superseded by science. And so like a butterfly emerging from a restrictive chrysalis, so science has emerged from religion and has allowed us to spread our wings like the beautiful enlightened butterflies that we are. He goes on to say that there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious, among whom I include not only the prejudiced but the uninformed, hope there is a dark corner of the physical universe or of the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. So science has, according to Atkins, this unique potential to explain everything we need to know about ourselves, the universe, and everything. There's two claims here that Atkins is making. The claim, first of all, that it's here that science is sufficient. It can give us this complete, fully orbed understanding of ourselves that really leaves no room for God or religion. And then the second claim that really underlies that claim is that science is unique. So on the one hand, science is sufficient. Secondly, science is unique. It alone can give us this publicly shared, reproducible knowledge about the world. Science is unique in its potential to give us reliable knowledge about the world. And really, that leaves no space for religious claims at all. So that's what I'd like us to think about. Before we do, here's another very famous scientist. This is James Watson, who, with Francis Crick, discovered the double helical structure of DNA. And he talks about people like me. He says, occasionally I meet them, and I'm a bit embarrassed because I cannot believe anyone who accepts truth by revelation. So obviously that hurts me a little bit. So part of what I want to do today as well is justify my own existence as a scientist who is also a committed Christian. Now, I take courage in this by the fact that throughout history, right up to the present day, there are many, many scientists who not just kind of struggle to reconcile their Christian faith, but are fundamentally motivated by it and have no problem holding their faith and their science together. James Watson started the Great Human Genome Project, this project to completely map the human genome. His successor, who eventually saw its completion, is this chap here. This is Francis Collins, who's now director of the National Institutes for Health in America. And he wrote in 2005 a book about the story of the Human Genome Project, about his own development as a scientist, but also his coming to accept the Christian faith for himself. He says this: I had started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism that now lay in ruins as I was forced to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis. So you see, if nothing else, that should give us pause to think it may not be quite as simple as people like Atkins or James Watson would have us believe. It's quite possible to be immersed in the sciences and yet find yourself intellectually compelled to accept the Christian faith. And that's Francis Collins' story. Now, let me tell you a bit more about one of the big breakthroughs in my research area. So one of the biggest breakthroughs in the last 15 years was this discovery by the Nobel Prize winner Shinya Yamanaka of the potential to generate induced pluripotent stem cells. What on earth are they? So pluripotent refers to the ability of stem cells to specialize into all of the different cells that make up our body. So when you were right at the beginning of your life, as an early embryo, you were basically a ball of stem cells. Those cells couldn't do anything, but they had the potential to specialize into your brains and your blood and your skin and all of the different cells that make your body. Now, that potential over the course of our development is very quickly lost. The cells are restricted and committed to becoming skin cells or bone cells. And it's an important protection against cancer and that kind of thing. But what Shinya Yamanaka discovered was you could take a tired old skin cell or even a bladder cell washed out in your wee, and you could grow those cells in the lab, and by turning on some very key genes that express themselves right at the beginning of development, you can kind of reprogram those cells and turn them back into stem cells once again. Amazing thing. So you can recover the potential that your cells had right at the beginning of your development. So maybe one day you could wee into a pot, scientists could take those cells, grow them up in the lab, turn them into stem cells, and then specialize them to become new neurons to treat your Parkinson's or something like that. Very, very important, very significant discovery. And the way he demonstrated that he'd done this was through an important experiment. He took some of his stem cells, that's on the right-hand side of the image, that he'd grown up in the lab. These are stem cells that he got from a mouse. He turned those into stem cells, and then he injected them back into an embryo of another mouse and then implanted that embryo. Now, if they were just old skin cells, they wouldn't do anything. They'd die. They wouldn't know what to do in that situation. But if they were stem cells, then his idea, his hypothesis, would be that those cells would fuse with that developing embryo and contribute to that developing mouth. And that's what he saw. He created, using this approach, a chimeric mouse. So half of that mouse is made from the cells that he'd had growing in a petri dish earlier, and the other half is from that embryo he injected those cells into. It's a very, very powerful demonstration of an astonishing discovery. And it's exactly this kind of thing that gives science such credibility in our culture. This is the credibility that Richard Dawkins is talking about here. He says, science boosts its claim to truth by its spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command and to predict what will happen and when. Science is unique in its ability to give us this reliable knowledge about the world. And so many people have said, well, you know what, science is so good at giving us reliable knowledge that really it's the only decent tool we have in order to understand ourselves, the universe, and everything. And so what we need to do is we need to restrict the type of explanations we use in understanding ourselves only to that which can be found out through the scientific method. Now, this is a very developed project. This is a philosopher of science called Daniel Dennett. And this is him writing about consciousness in a book he humbly entitled Consciousness Explained. And he talks explicitly about his methodology. There is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. We can, in principle, we're not there yet, we're working on it, account for every mental phenomena using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials. So he's saying, science is able to help us understand ourselves completely with no excess. All we need is biology, chemistry, and physics in order to understand ourselves, the universe, and everything. Now, that can lead to some rather counterintuitive ideas. Just to give one example, this is Richard Dawkins talking about love. He's asked about love by a Christian interviewer, in this case, who asked him, when you think about your wife, what does love mean? Dawkins says, well, we've been into that before. It's an emotion which is a manifestation of brain stuff. Jesus said, love is the purpose of life. Does that sound nonsense to you? It sounds like something grafted on, a superfluous excrescence on life which I feel I understand better. But it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So for Dawkins, love is nothing more than a manifestation of brain stuff. And to see it as of deeper significance of that, of more significance, of greater meaning than that, is to impose something on reality. It's to graft something on that's not really there. Now, intuitively, that doesn't seem sufficient. Love is of deep significance to what it means to be a human being. Love lies right at the heart of what gives our lives meaning, of significance. It's why we do what we do. And to say that that is just to tell ourselves a story that's not true, to graft something on, to impose something on cold, hard reality, doesn't seem adequate. It doesn't seem sufficient as a way of understanding who we are and what we are as human beings. Now, that's a soft argument against this type of thinking, but there's also a harder philosophical argument that we need to be aware of as well. And the clue to that comes up in the last thing Richard Dawkins says when he starts talking about our brains. It doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So what, in this view, are our brains? What are they for? This is Patricia Churchland talking about the function of our brains. Boiled down to essentials, the principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. A fancier style of representing, so she's talking about our ability to think and understand and try and make sense of the world, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chance of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So the reason we have brains, the reason we think, the reason we try and make sense of the world, the reason we do science is not ultimately to discover what's true. Because that's not what our brains are for. The reason we have brains in our skull is simply to help us survive, and that is all. Now, sometimes survival benefit and truth might align. We need to know it's not a good idea to stroke lions or swim with crocodiles and that kind of thing. But often, that won't be the case. And religion is a good case in point. The vast majority of human beings are religious, and yet religion has no truth benefit in this type of view. It's there simply as a survival mechanism, a way of ensuring social cohesion or whatever. But you see the problem with that. If we can't trust our brains to help us discover what's true and real, then we can't trust our brains even when our brains tell us we can't trust our brains. The whole idea is a dead end. It's what philosophers would call self-refuting. And people realise this. This is another philosopher and neuroscientist who's not a believer, but he sees the issue here. He says this biologistic image, this attempt to squeeze ourselves only into what biology can tell us, this biologistic image of humans effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility, of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorise about evolution or to develop neuroscience. And this is the key point. If Darwin's On the Origin of the Species really were the last word on humanity, the only thing there is to say, then it could not have been written. So you see, this attempt to squeeze ourselves into only what biology, chemistry and physics can tell us, this attempt to kind of censor out anything in our human story that's not validated by a scientific experiment, ultimately means our human story no longer makes sense. It becomes incoherent. In order to understand ourselves, we need to go beyond what biology alone can tell us. Now, this is Professor of Paleontology at Cambridge, who's also a Christian, and he presents us with an alternative here. He says, if, however, the universe is actually the product of a rational mind, and evolution is simply the search engine that, in leading to sentience and consciousness, allows us to discover the fundamental architecture of the universe, then things not only start to make much better sense, but they're also much more interesting. Now that is interesting, but how do we know? If science really is the only reliable way we have of knowing anything, is this just speculation? How do we discover whether there is more to life than what biology, chemistry, and physics can tell us? Max Planck makes this point, and experiments are the only means of knowledge at our disposal. The rest is poetry and imagination. And Bertrand Russell puts it very strongly. He says, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, there's a problem with what Bertrand Russell is saying here, because he is not a scientist. He is a philosopher who came up with that while sitting in his chair smoking his pipe. He's making a claim to knowledge, and yet it's not a claim, and not a knowledge that he attained by scientific methods. He's saying, in other words, we don't really need to listen to him, so we're not going to. But what I want us to think about is the mistake he's making. And here's the mistake. This rather old, fusty philosophy of science textbook lays it out. This is the mistake. If he be a man engaged in any important inquiry, women don't make this mistake, you'll be pleased to know, he must have a method. And he will be under a strong and constant temptation to make a metaphysics, almost like a religion, out of his method. That is, to suppose the universe ultimately of such a sort that his method must be appropriate and successful. Now, I don't know if that makes much sense to you. It's actually a very basic mistake to make. It's a mistake that my daughter had learned not to make by the time she was about 1 year old. So this is my daughter at about that age. Before this point, I could be playing with my phone in front of her like a good father, and she'd obviously want to play with my phone. But at that stage, I could simply put my phone away in my pocket, and she'd forget about it and move on to wanting something else she couldn't have. But a few months later, that no longer worked. She'd learned something about the universe, which is that just because she couldn't see something didn't mean it wasn't available for her to play with. She just needed to use a different method in order to get access to my phone. She needed to put on a cute face like that, and she knows she could play with my phone very quickly. And scientists learn this very early on as well. We know that just because you've got this really good assay that always gives reliable results, we can't say, well, you know what, I'm going to only use this assay to understand my subject area, and I'm going to restrict my understanding of my subject only into what I can find out using this particular experiment. Or an astronomer doesn't look through her telescope and say, well, you know, my telescope can only see so far, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and limit my understanding of the universe only into what I can see through my telescope. Now, scientists ask a very important question, the hypothetical question. They ask, what if? What if there's more out there to discover? How will I go about getting access to it? So let's think, as we finish, briefly about this question of purpose that's come up a few times in our discussion so far. What if there is a purpose to this universe? What if that purpose is love? How would I discover that for myself? Here's a helpful quote by a philosopher theologian called Leslie Newbigin. He says this, he says, cause can be discovered by science, but purpose cannot. Because until purpose has been realized, it is hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Newbigin recognizes that purpose is something that persons have. People who can look forward into the future and form desires and make plans and then set about to achieve those plans. That's what purpose is. And as such, it's hidden. Until the purpose is realized, it's hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. He gives an example of a building site. He says, imagine you come across a space and there's some bricks stacked up here and there and some tools lying around, and you decide that there's a purpose going on here. There's something going on. There's a purpose to what you see in front of you. It's a good analogy, I think, because that's how we encounter life. We look around and there's all kinds of chaos and mess, but at the same time, so much of what we do, what we think, the way we live seems meaningful and significant. There's signs of purpose all around. Things actually matter. But how are we to discover what that purpose is? Well, he says you've got two choices. You can go back to the building site every single day and see what emerges from the rubble and the form the building takes. That's the kind of empirical approach. Or you can talk to the architect or the builder, the one whose purpose it is, and ask them to reveal it to you. And he says, when it comes to discovering the purpose of your life or the purpose of the universe, waiting around until the end is not an option for us. If we're to discover the purpose of why we're here, the one whose purpose it is needs to make it known to us. At the heart of Christianity is a very remarkable claim that the one whose purpose it is has not just made his purpose, but his very self knowable and accessible to us. The beginning of one of the early accounts of the life of Jesus Christ, it says these very famous words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. That word is the Greek word logos. It refers to the Greek idea that behind everything there was this kind of underlying rationality, a way of making sense of this world. And John takes that idea and he does something very interesting. The first thing he does is he personalizes it. He says he was in the beginning with God. And then he goes on and does something even more astonishing. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. At the heart of Christianity is this claim that God, the one whose purpose it is, has made himself accessible to us. He became a human being. He made himself knowable to us. Ultimately, the reason science is so powerful, so successful, is not, I think, just because of the ingenuity of its methods, nor is it just because of the rigors of peer review and all of the kind of things that underlie it. Ultimately, science is successful because of the accessibility of its subject matter. Science deals with the stuff you can kind of get hold of, the stuff you can prod and poke and manipulate and control. When science advances, it's because new techniques, new imaging, new concepts have come that have allowed us to gain access to a whole new swathe of reality. That's why science is successful, because of the accessibility of its subject matter. The claim of Christianity is this, that God himself has made himself accessible to us. He's made himself, first of all, accessible to our scrutiny. At the heart of Christianity is this claim that God has entered into human history. He's impacted history. He's changed lives in history. And that impact can be felt right up to the present day, so that here we are in a stairwell of the Student Union 2,000 miles away, 2,000 years later, still talking about him. This is a claim you can scrutinize, a claim you can look into and investigate. More than that, this claim says that God himself has made himself accessible to people like you and me. Because ultimate reality is not a kind of abstract theory that you can contemplate on, nor is it some raw material, some law that you can prod and poke, but it's a person, and a person who makes himself available for us to know. Now, that might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. I'm a scientist. We're not people. We prefer dissecting things, not talking to them. The idea that ultimate reality is not something that you can control in the lab, but someone who makes himself available for you to know could make you feel uncomfortable. When I first met my wife, Naomi, she said to me, "Hello, my name's Naomi." If at that point I'd have said to her, "Look, I'm sorry, I'm a scientist. I can't accept truth by revelation. I'm going to need to get some more evidence for that claim," she ultimately wouldn't be my wife now. I'd never have actually got to know her. In order to get to know someone, we need to open ourselves up to the possibility that they want to be known by us. And this is what Christianity claims, that God himself has made himself knowable to us. And if you say, "Look, I'm only going to believe in stuff that I can do a scientific experiment on," ultimately you're deciding the answer even before you've begun your investigation. You're attempting to tell the universe how it should be. It's not, in other words, very scientific.